My tenant destroyed my house and said, "Sue me, you'll never see a penny." I shook his hand and wished him luck. His background check revealed his real identity. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke hit me like a physical blow as I turned the key. In the front door of my rental property at 847 Maple Street. What I discovered behind that door would challenge everything I thought I knew about human nature, the legal system, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. My name is Thomas Richardson, and I'm a 62-year-old retired high school principal who spent 40 years believing that most people were fundamentally decent if given proper guidance and fair treatment. I had converted my late mother's house into a rental property 5 years earlier, providing affordable housing for working families while supplementing my modest teacher's pension. The house itself was a modest 3-bedroom colonial that my mother had maintained meticulously for 37 years. After her passing, I had invested $47,000 in renovations. New hardwood floors, updated kitchen appliances, fresh paint throughout, modern fixtures, and a completely renovated bathroom. The property represented not just an investment, but a labor of love, honoring my mother's memory and providing quality housing for tenants who needed a safe, clean place to call home. For 4.5 years, I had been blessed with wonderful tenants. The Martinez family had lived there for 3 years, treating the house like their own and leaving it in better condition than when they moved in. After they relocated for Mr. Martinez's job promotion, I had rented to a young couple who stayed for 18 months before purchasing their own home, also leaving the property in excellent condition. But 6 months ago, everything changed when I met Derek Sullivan. Derek had responded to my Craigslist advertisement for the rental property with what seemed like the perfect inquiry. He claimed to be a freelance IT consultant working remotely for various technology companies. He provided references from previous landlords that seemed legitimate, offered to pay the first month's rent and security deposit immediately, and presented himself as a quiet, professional tenant who traveled frequently for work. His application appeared flawless. Credit score of 760, annual income of $85,000, no criminal background according to the basic tenant screening service I used. He even provided bank statements showing substantial savings and steady direct deposits that supported his claimed income level. During our initial meeting, Derek seemed like the ideal tenant. He was well-dressed, articulate, and asked intelligent questions about the property's amenities and neighborhood. He complimented my mother's choice in decorating and expressed appreciation for the quality of the renovations I had completed. "Mr. Richardson," he had said during our walkthrough, "this is exactly what I've been looking for. A quiet, well-maintained home where I can focus on my work without distractions. I can tell you've put a lot of care into maintaining this property." I had been impressed by his professionalism and apparent respect for the property. When he handed me certified funds for the first month's rent and security deposit without negotiation, I felt confident that I had found another excellent tenant who would treat my mother's house with the respect it deserved. For the first 2 months, Derek seemed to validate my positive first impression. He paid rent promptly via electronic transfer, maintained the lawn without being asked, and caused no disturbances to the neighbors. His lease agreement included standard provisions about property maintenance, noise levels, and restrictions on modifications to the house. But sometime during the 3rd month, I began receiving concerning reports from neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door and had been my mother's friend for over 20 years, called me on a Tuesday evening in October with news that made my stomach clench with worry. "Thomas, I hate to bother you, but there have been some strange activities at your rental house. Derek has been having people over at all hours of the night. Yesterday, I counted 7 different cars in your driveway at 2 a.m., and there was loud music playing until dawn." This was troubling news. Derek's lease agreement specifically prohibited parties and required that any guests staying overnight be approved in advance. More importantly, the house was located in a quiet residential neighborhood where late-night disturbances were both inappropriate and potentially illegal under local noise ordinances. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like these need to be shared. I decided to drive by the property the following evening to assess the situation myself. What I saw confirmed Mrs. Chen's concerns and revealed additional problems that would prove to be just the beginning of Derek's transformation from model tenant to my worst nightmare. The front yard, which I had maintained in pristine condition, was littered with beer bottles, cigarette butts, and fast food containers. The carefully maintained flower beds that my mother had planted decades earlier were trampled and dying. Most concerning, several windows had been left open despite the cold October weather, and I could hear loud music and multiple voices coming from inside the house. I knocked on the front door, intending to have a polite but firm conversation with Derek about adhering to the lease terms and being respectful to the neighbors. When he answered the door 20 minutes later, the man who greeted me bore little resemblance to the professional, courteous tenant I had met 6 months earlier. Derek appeared at the door wearing a stained undershirt and shorts, clearly intoxicated, with the smell of alcohol and marijuana emanating from behind him. His previously neat appearance had been replaced by several days' worth of stubble, unkempt hair, and bloodshot eyes that suggested either lack of sleep or substance abuse. "Oh, hey landlord guy," Derek said with a dismissive tone that immediately set me on edge. "What brings you by my place this evening?" His casual reference to my place was the first indication that Derek's attitude toward the property had fundamentally shifted from respectful tenant to entitled occupant who viewed my mother's house as his personal domain. "Derek, I've received complaints from neighbors about noise and disturbances late at night. I wanted to check in and remind you about the lease provisions regarding parties and overnight guests." Derek's response revealed a personality transformation that I hadn't anticipated when I approved his tenancy application. "Look, old man, I pay rent on time, so what I do in my house is my business. If the neighbors don't like it, they can call the cops or move somewhere else. I'm not running a library here." His confrontational tone and obvious disrespect caught me completely off guard. This was not the polite, professional man who had impressed me during our initial meeting. Something fundamental had changed in Derek's circumstances or personality, and the consequences were becoming apparent in his treatment of my property and the surrounding community. "Derek, this isn't your house. You're renting it from me, and the lease agreement clearly states that you'll maintain the property in good condition and avoid disturbing the neighbors. I need you to comply with those terms." Derek's laugh was cold and calculating, revealing a side of his personality that had been completely hidden during our previous interactions. "What are you going to do about it? Evict me? Good luck with that process. I know my rights as a tenant, and I know how long it takes to get someone out of a rental property in this state. By the time you could legally force me to leave, I'll be long gone anyway." His words sent a chill through me because they suggested that Derek had researched tenant rights law specifically to understand how to exploit the system to his advantage. This wasn't an irresponsible tenant who needed guidance. This was someone who was deliberately violating his lease agreement while using legal protections to avoid consequences. I left that evening with a growing sense of unease about what Derek might be planning and how far his disrespect for my property might extend. Unfortunately, I would soon discover that my worst fears were just the beginning of a nightmare that would test my faith in human decency and the legal system. Over the following weeks, Derek's behavior escalated from inappropriate to destructive. The noise complaints from neighbors increased in frequency and severity. Mrs. Chen reported that Derek had been verbally abusive when she politely asked him to turn down music at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night. Other neighbors began calling me directly to express concerns about the types of people Derek was bringing to the property and the impact his behavior was having on their quiet residential street. But the real shock came during my next visit to the property in early November. I had given Derek the required 24-hour notice for a routine inspection to assess any maintenance needs and document the condition of the house for my records. What I found when I entered my mother's house was beyond anything I could have imagined. The beautiful hardwood floors that I had refinished at considerable expense were gouged, stained, and covered with burns from cigarettes that had been carelessly dropped or extinguished directly on the wood. The kitchen, which I had renovated with new appliances and granite countertops, was destroyed. The refrigerator door hung open, no longer properly closing, while the interior was filled with rotting food that created an overpowering stench. The granite countertops were chipped and stained with what appeared to be burn marks from hot pans, placed directly on the surface. The living room walls, which I had painted just before Derek moved in, were covered with holes that appeared to have been punched by fists or created by thrown objects. Several windows had been broken and crudely repaired with duct tape and cardboard. The carpet in the bedrooms, which had been professionally cleaned before Derek's tenancy, was stained with substances I couldn't identify and didn't want to investigate too closely. But the bathroom was the most shocking discovery. The toilet had been clogged for what appeared to be weeks, causing sewage to overflow onto the floor and create water damage that extended into the hallway. The medicine cabinet mirror was shattered, with glass shards scattered across the sink and floor. The bathtub was filled with empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, and debris that suggested it hadn't been used for washing in months. The basement revealed additional damage that would prove to be both expensive and dangerous. Derek had apparently been using space heaters throughout the house to supplement the heating system, but had positioned them unsafely near curtains and furniture. Scorch marks on the walls and ceiling indicated that he had come dangerously close to starting a house fire that could have destroyed not only my property, but endangered the entire neighborhood. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Derek had been running some kind of business operation from the house. Multiple cell phones, computers, and electronic devices were scattered throughout the rooms, connected to extension cords and power strips that created fire hazards. Empty packaging from expensive electronics suggested that Derek was either reselling stolen goods or operating some other illegal enterprise from my mother's house. I documented everything with photographs, knowing that I would need evidence for both the eviction process and potential criminal charges. The damage was so extensive that I estimated repairs would cost at least $35,000, nearly the entire amount I had invested in renovating the property originally. When Derek returned to the house during my inspection, his reaction to my obvious shock and dismay revealed the true extent of his contempt for both my property and me personally. "I see you're checking out my redecorating," Derek said with a smirk that showed he took perverse pleasure in my distress. "I've been making the place more comfortable for my lifestyle." "Derek, this is completely unacceptable. You've destroyed thousands of dollars worth of improvements and created health and safety hazards throughout the house. This damage goes far beyond normal wear and tear." Derek's response showed that his earlier disrespect had evolved into something approaching malicious intent. "That's the thing about rental properties, old man. Shit happens. Maybe you should have thought about that before deciding to be a landlord. This is just the cost of doing business." His casual dismissal of the destruction he had caused was infuriating, but his next words would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. "Besides, what are you going to do about it? Sue me? Good luck collecting anything. I don't have any assets you can touch, and by the time you get through the legal system, I'll be long gone. You'll never see a penny." Derek's confidence in his ability to avoid consequences for his actions was both shocking and revealing. This wasn't random destruction caused by irresponsibility or addiction. This was calculated vandalism committed by someone who believed he was immune to accountability. But it was his final statement that would haunt me for weeks and ultimately lead to the most satisfying resolution I could have imagined. "You picked the wrong guy to mess with, Richardson. I've been playing this game a lot longer than you have, and I always win. You're just another sucker landlord who's about to learn an expensive lesson about the real world." As Derek spoke those words, something shifted in my approach to the situation. For 4 decades as a high school principal, I had dealt with difficult people by appealing to their better nature and assuming that reasonable solutions could be found through patient communication. But Derek's obvious pleasure in destroying my property and his confident assertion that he would face no consequences revealed that I was dealing with someone who viewed kindness as weakness and legal processes as obstacles to be circumvented. That evening, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of this entire situation. Instead of immediately beginning eviction proceedings or confronting Derek with threats of legal action, I would take time to research exactly who I was dealing with and what options were available to someone in my position. The next morning, I called Derek and asked to meet with him again. When he answered the door, I could see he was expecting another confrontation that he was confident he would win. "Derek," I said calmly, "I've thought about our conversation yesterday, and I think you're absolutely right." His expression shifted, from defensive smugness to surprised confusion. "I'm a retired teacher who got into the rental business without really understanding what I was getting into. You clearly have more experience with these situations than I do, and I respect that." Derek's guard dropped noticeably as he processed my apparent capitulation to his superior knowledge and experience. "I don't want to get into a long legal battle that will cost both of us time and money. You're right that eviction processes are expensive and time-consuming, And you're probably right that collecting damages would be difficult even if I won in court. Derek nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose threats had achieved their intended effect. So here's what I propose, I continued. You finish out your lease term, and we'll call it even. No eviction, no lawsuits, no hassles for either of us. When your lease expires in 4 months, you move out, and we both move on with our lives. Derek extended his hand with a grin that showed he believed he had completely outmaneuvered a naive retiree who had been intimidated into accepting defeat. Richardson, you're smarter than I gave you credit for. That's exactly the right decision for both of us. I shook his hand and wished him luck, knowing that the next 4 months would give me time to conduct the investigation that would ultimately expose exactly who Derek Sullivan really was and what consequences he would face for his actions. That afternoon, I contacted a private investigator named Maria Santos who specialized in tenant fraud and identity verification. Maria was a former police detective who had started her own firm after retiring from the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Mr. Richardson, Maria said during our initial consultation, what you're describing sounds like a classic case of professional tenant fraud. There are people who make a living by renting properties with false identities and fabricated references, then destroying the properties while using tenant protection laws to avoid immediate consequences. Maria explained that professional tenant fraud was a growing problem in many metropolitan areas, with criminals who had perfected the art of appearing legitimate during the application process while planning to exploit and destroy rental properties from the beginning. These individuals often use sophisticated identity theft techniques to create false backgrounds that pass basic tenant screening. They may use stolen social security numbers, fabricated employment histories, and references who are actually accomplices in their scheme. The investigation that Maria conducted over the following weeks revealed that my instincts about Derek had been correct, but the full scope of his criminal activities was far more extensive than I had imagined. Derek Sullivan was not his real name. His actual identity was Derek Michael Thompson, a career criminal with convictions for fraud, identity theft, and property destruction in 3 different states. The social security number he had provided on his rental application belonged to a man named Harold Peterson, who had died in 2019, and Derek had been using this deceased person's identity to rent properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. Maria's investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of Derek's identity theft operation. He had obtained Harold Peterson's death certificate, social security number, and personal information through what appeared to be a network of accomplices who specialized in harvesting identities from recently deceased individuals. Derek then used this information to create a completely fabricated persona that included fake employment history, manufactured bank statements, and references who were actually other criminals in his network. The bank statements and employment verification that had seemed so convincing during his application process were completely fabricated using professional-grade document creation software and printing equipment. Derek had invested thousands of dollars in creating the infrastructure necessary to produce authentic-looking financial documents that would pass casual inspection by landlords who relied on basic tenant screening services. But Derek's operation extended far beyond simple identity theft. Maria discovered that he had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that involved multiple aspects of fraud and property destruction. He supported himself through a combination of tenant fraud, identity theft, credit card fraud, and what appeared to be a sophisticated operation involving the theft and resale of electronics. The electronics operation was particularly elaborate. Derek had been working with a network of thieves who would steal high-end consumer goods from retail stores, shipping facilities, and private residences. Derek would then use rental properties as temporary warehouses where stolen goods could be stored, repackaged, and sold through online marketplaces. He had developed relationships with buyers across the country who would purchase stolen electronics at substantially reduced prices, creating a profitable pipeline for moving stolen merchandise. Maria's investigation revealed that Derek had been using my mother's house as a central hub for this criminal operation. The constant stream of visitors that Mrs. Chen had observed were actually buyers and sellers in Derek's stolen goods network. The electronic devices scattered throughout the house weren't just random possessions. They were inventory in an ongoing criminal enterprise that generated thousands of dollars in illegal income every month. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Derek's property destruction wasn't random vandalism or neglect. It was a calculated strategy designed to maximize his profits from each rental property while minimizing his legal exposure. Maria explained that Derek had perfected a system for extracting maximum value from rental properties while ensuring that any legal consequences would be minimal and delayed. Derek Thompson has been refining this criminal methodology for over 7 years, Maria explained during one of our follow-up meetings. He targets single-property landlords who he believes will be less likely to pursue aggressive legal action, then uses their properties as both temporary housing and business locations for his criminal activities. Derek's selection criteria for rental properties was methodical and revealing. He specifically sought out older landlords who owned only 1 or 2 rental properties, assuming they would be less experienced with tenant fraud and more likely to accept financial losses rather than engage in protracted legal battles. He avoided properties owned by large management companies or landlords who appeared to have significant real estate experience. He also targeted properties in residential neighborhoods, where his criminal activities would be less likely to attract immediate attention from law enforcement. Commercial areas or high-crime neighborhoods would have more police presence and greater scrutiny, while quiet residential streets like Maple Street provided the perfect cover for his illegal operations. Once Derek gained access to a rental property, his methodology was designed to maximize both his criminal profits and the property damage that would serve as his psychological weapon against landlords. The destruction wasn't random. It was calculated to be expensive, demoralizing, and difficult to repair quickly. The hardwood floor damage at my mother's house, for example, had been created using specific techniques that Derek had learned would be particularly costly to repair. The burns and gouges were placed in locations that would require entire sections of flooring to be replaced rather than simply refinished. Similarly, the kitchen damage had been designed to destroy expensive appliances and countertops that would cost thousands of dollars to replace. The bathroom destruction was perhaps the most revealing aspect of Derek's methodology. The sewage overflow had been created deliberately by flushing inappropriate items down the toilet, then allowing the backup to continue for weeks until it caused maximum water damage to surrounding areas. This type of damage is particularly expensive to repair because it requires not only plumbing work, but also extensive remediation to address water damage and potential mold issues. Maria's investigation also revealed that Derek had been documenting his destruction of my property with photographs and videos that he shared with other criminals in his network. These images served both as trophies of his successful intimidation tactics and as instructional materials for other criminals who wanted to replicate his methods. Derek Thompson treats property destruction as both a source of personal satisfaction and a professional skill that he's developed over years of criminal activity, Maria explained. He takes pride in his ability to cause maximum damage while using tenant protection laws to avoid immediate consequences. The investigation also uncovered Derek's financial methodology for avoiding legal accountability. He had developed a sophisticated system for hiding assets and income that he believed would make him judgment-proof, even if landlords successfully sued him for property damage. Derek maintained multiple bank accounts under various false identities, spreading his criminal proceeds across different financial institutions to make asset recovery more difficult. He also invested heavily in cryptocurrency, believing that digital assets would be harder for authorities to track and seize. Additionally, he purchased high-value items like jewelry, electronics, and collectibles that could be easily liquidated or hidden if legal problems arose. But Derek had made several critical errors in his asset protection strategy that would ultimately lead to his downfall. First, he had become overconfident in his ability to avoid legal consequences, leading him to accumulate more assets than he could effectively hide. Second, he had underestimated the sophistication of modern financial investigation, techniques that could trace even carefully hidden assets. Finally, he had targeted a victim who had both the time and resources to pursue a thorough investigation, rather than accepting immediate losses. Maria's investigation revealed that Derek had accumulated over $340,000 in assets through his fraudulent activities, including cash in multiple bank accounts, cryptocurrency investments worth approximately $85,000, a luxury BMW registered under an alias, and valuable electronics and jewelry stored in rented storage facilities across 3 different states. More importantly, Derek's confidence in his asset protection strategy had led him to maintain detailed financial records that documented his criminal activities. He had been keeping spreadsheets that tracked his income from various illegal enterprises, apparently for tax evasion purposes. These records, which Derek thought were safely hidden on encrypted hard drives, provided a comprehensive roadmap of his criminal activities and asset locations. The investigation also revealed that Derek had been operating his criminal enterprise for much longer than initially suspected. Financial records showed that he had been running similar operations since 2016, victimizing dozens of landlords across Washington, Oregon, California, and Nevada. The total damage he had caused exceeded $800,000, with individual victims losing between $15,000 and $65,000 in property damage and lost rental income. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Derek had been specifically targeting elderly landlords, who he believed would be easiest to intimidate and exploit. Maria found evidence that Derek had been researching potential victims through public records, looking for properties owned by individuals over age 55 who appeared to have limited real estate experience. Derek's victim selection process included reviewing obituaries to identify recently widowed individuals who might have inherited rental properties, searching property records for single property owners, and even monitoring online forums where new landlords sought advice about tenant management. This level of premeditation demonstrated that Derek's criminal activities were far more sophisticated and malicious than simple opportunistic fraud. The investigation also uncovered Derek's network of accomplices who provided various services that supported his criminal operation. These included individuals who specialized in creating false identities, others who provided fake employment verification and references, and a sophisticated network of thieves and fences who supplied stolen goods for his electronics resale operation. One of Derek's primary accomplices was a woman named Rebecca Martinez, who had been posing as a former landlord to provide positive references for Derek's rental applications. Rebecca had been paid $500 for each false reference she provided, and she had been supporting Derek's criminal activities for over 3 years. Her phone number appeared on rental applications across multiple states, always providing glowing recommendations for Derek's reliability and cleanliness as a tenant. Another accomplice was a man named Kevin Walsh, who specialized in creating fake employment verification for criminals like Derek. Kevin operated what appeared to be a legitimate IT consulting company, but actually provided false employment documentation for criminals who needed to demonstrate steady income for rental applications, loan applications, and other financial transactions. The electronics theft network was the most extensive aspect of Derek's criminal operation. Maria's investigation identified at least 12 individuals who were involved in stealing, transporting, storing, and reselling stolen electronics through Derek's operation. This network generated approximately $50,000 per month in illegal income, with Derek receiving a percentage of all sales that flowed through his rental property warehouses. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Derek had been using rental properties not just as warehouses, but as staging areas for additional criminal activities. Evidence suggested that Derek had been using my mother's house as a meeting location for planning burglaries, discussing target locations, and dividing proceeds from various criminal enterprises. The investigation revealed that Derek's confidence in his ability to avoid legal consequences was based on his experience with previous victims who had either accepted their losses or pursued legal action that Derek had successfully delayed and frustrated. He had developed a sophisticated understanding of tenant protection laws and had used this knowledge to exploit legal processes that were designed to protect legitimate tenants from unscrupulous landlords. Derek's legal strategy typically involved filing counter-complaints against landlords who attempted to evict him, claiming harassment, discrimination, or unsafe living conditions. These counter-complaints would delay eviction proceedings for months while Derek continued his destructive activities. He had also learned to identify jurisdictions where tenant protection laws were particularly strong and eviction processes were especially lengthy. But Derek had made a fundamental miscalculation when he targeted me. Unlike his previous victims, I had the time, resources, and determination to pursue a comprehensive investigation rather than accepting immediate losses or engaging in the lengthy legal processes that Derek had learned to manipulate. More importantly, Derek's criminal activities had finally attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies who were investigating the multi-state identity theft and stolen goods networks that supported his operation. Maria's investigation had connected Derek to ongoing federal investigations, transforming what appeared to be a simple landlord-tenant dispute into a complex federal criminal case. But the most shocking discovery was that Derek was currently wanted by federal authorities in connection with a multi-state fraud scheme that had victimized dozens of landlords and caused over $800,000 in property damage across Washington, Oregon, and California. Mr. Richardson, Maria explained during our follow-up meeting, Derek Thompson is what law enforcement calls a professional destroyer. He specifically targets single-property landlords who he believes will be easier to intimidate and less likely to pursue aggressive legal action. Maria's investigation revealed Derek's complete methodology for selecting and exploiting rental properties. He targeted older landlords who owned just one or two rental properties, assuming they would be less experienced with tenant fraud and more likely to accept financial losses, rather than engage in protracted legal battles. He used stolen identities to pass basic tenant screening, then gradually escalated his destructive behavior, while using tenant protection laws to buy time before landlords could legally remove him from properties. His pattern was to cause maximum damage in the shortest possible time, then disappear before facing legal consequences. The good news, Maria continued, is that Derek Thompson has finally made a mistake that will allow law enforcement to locate and arrest him. By using a deceased person's social security number on an official lease agreement, he's committed federal identity theft. The property damage he's caused at your house, combined with his use of the property for illegal business activities, gives local authorities multiple charges they can file. But Maria's investigation had uncovered an even more valuable piece of information that would transform Derek's confident assertion that I would never see a penny into a devastating miscalculation. Mr. Richardson, Derek Thompson is not as judgment-proof as he believes. We've traced several bank accounts, cryptocurrency holdings, and valuable assets that he's accumulated through his criminal activities. He's been transferring money to offshore accounts and purchasing high-value items under false names, thinking he's hidden his wealth from potential victims. The investigation revealed that Derek had accumulated over $340,000 in assets through his fraudulent activities, including cash in multiple bank accounts, cryptocurrency investments, a luxury vehicle registered under an alias, and valuable electronics and jewelry stored in a rented storage facility. More importantly, Maria continued, Derek Thompson has made the mistake of targeting a retired educator who has both the time and motivation to pursue justice through proper legal channels. Most of his previous victims were working families, who couldn't afford to invest in thorough investigations or lengthy legal proceedings. Armed with this information, I began planning a response that would ensure Derek faced full accountability for his actions while recovering compensation for the damage he had caused to my mother's house. The first step was coordinating with law enforcement to ensure Derek's arrest on federal charges. Maria had developed contacts within the FBI's Identity Theft Task Force, who were eager to locate Derek Thompson and close his case. The second step was preparing a comprehensive civil lawsuit that would target all of Derek's hidden assets and ensure that his victims received compensation for the damage he had caused. But the most satisfying aspect of the plan was that Derek would be completely unaware of what was coming until the moment federal agents knocked on his door. For the next 2 months, I maintained the facade of the defeated landlord, who had been intimidated into accepting his losses. Derek continued his destructive behavior, apparently convinced that he had successfully neutralized any threat of consequences. During this period, Derek's confidence in his immunity from accountability led him to become even more brazen in his activities. He began openly operating what appeared to be a stolen electronics operation from the house, with a steady stream of visitors exchanging cash for high-end consumer goods. He stopped making any pretense of maintaining the property, treating my mother's house like a temporary warehouse for his criminal enterprise. The neighbors' complaints escalated accordingly, but I advised them that law enforcement was aware of the situation and that Derek's activities were being monitored as part of an ongoing investigation. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching Derek's behavior with growing concern, called me in early January with news that confirmed the investigation was proceeding exactly as planned. Thomas, there have been some very strange deliveries to your rental house. Men in expensive cars have been dropping off boxes of electronics, and Derek has been paying them with large amounts of cash. This looks like some kind of illegal business operation. I assured Mrs. Chen that appropriate authorities were aware of Derek's activities and that the situation would be resolved soon. What I didn't tell her was that federal agents had been surveilling Derek for weeks, documenting his illegal activities and gathering evidence for multiple criminal charges. The end came on February 14th, Valentine's Day, in a coordinated operation that satisfied every aspect of justice I had hoped to achieve. At 6:47 a.m., FBI agents executed a federal arrest warrant at 847 Maple Street, taking Derek Thompson into custody on charges of identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The arrest was coordinated with local police who filed additional charges related to property destruction, operating an illegal business, violation of zoning laws, and maintaining a criminal enterprise. I watched from across the street as Derek was led away in handcuffs, his confident smirk replaced by the shocked expression of someone who had finally encountered consequences he couldn't manipulate or avoid. The federal agents had arrived with multiple vehicles, crime scene technicians, and specialists trained in seizing electronic evidence and financial records. The search of my mother's house revealed the full extent of Derek's criminal operation. Federal agents seized over $47,000 worth of stolen electronics, detailed financial records documenting years of criminal activity, multiple false identity documents, and equipment used to create fake employment verification and bank statements. But the arrest was only the beginning of Derek's accountability for his actions. The federal investigation that followed revealed a criminal network that extended far beyond Derek's individual activities and involved dozens of accomplices across multiple states. Derek's arrest triggered a coordinated federal operation that law enforcement agencies had been planning for months. The FBI had been investigating the multi-state identity theft and stolen goods network that Derek was part of, and his activities at my property had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to dismantle the entire criminal organization. Within 48 hours of Derek's arrest, federal agents had executed search warrants and made arrests in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Las Vegas, and Denver. The operation, which the FBI designated Operation False Identity, resulted in the arrest of 23 individuals who had been involved in various aspects of the criminal network that Derek had been part of. Rebecca Martinez, who had been providing false landlord references, was arrested at her home in Portland and charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and identity theft. Kevin Walsh, who had been providing fake employment verification, was arrested in Denver and charged with wire fraud and racketeering. The investigation revealed that these accomplices had been supporting criminal activities for dozens of individuals like Derek, who specialized in tenant fraud and property destruction. The electronics theft network was completely dismantled, with arrests of thieves, fences, and buyers who had been participating in the stolen goods operation. Federal agents recovered over $200,000 worth of stolen merchandise and identified victims across 4 states who had been burglarized to supply Derek's illegal operation. Perhaps most satisfying was the discovery that Derek's victims were far more numerous than initially suspected. The federal investigation identified 47 separate victims who had suffered property damage and financial losses due to Derek's criminal activities. Many of these victims had been too intimidated or financially unable to pursue legal action, allowing Derek to continue his criminal activities without facing consequences. The federal prosecution of Derek's case became a landmark prosecution that established new precedents for prosecuting sophisticated tenant fraud operations. Federal prosecutors were able to demonstrate that Derek's activities constituted a continuing criminal enterprise under federal racketeering laws, which carried much more severe penalties than simple property damage or fraud charges. The federal charges carried a potential sentence of 25 years in prison, while the local charges added another 7 years to his potential incarceration. More importantly for all of Derek's victims, the government's asset forfeiture proceedings would recover the money Derek had stolen from dozens of victims and ensure that restitution was paid to everyone he had victimized. The asset forfeiture process was particularly comprehensive because federal investigators had access to sophisticated financial investigation tools that could trace even carefully hidden assets. The investigation revealed that Derek had accumulated over $485,000 in assets through his fraudulent activities, significantly more than Maria's initial investigation had uncovered. Derek's financial records, which he had maintained for tax evasion purposes, provided federal investigators with a detailed roadmap of his criminal activities and asset locations. These records revealed bank accounts in multiple states, cryptocurrency investments that Derek had believed were untraceable, valuable items stored in rented facilities, and even real estate purchases made under false identities. The federal investigation also revealed that Derek had been receiving financial support from organized crime figures who were investing in his criminal operations in exchange for a percentage of his profits. This connection to organized crime elevated Derek's case to the level of a federal racketeering prosecution, which carried mandatory minimum sentences and asset forfeiture provisions that ensured complete financial accountability. The civil lawsuit I filed against Derek Thompson was successful beyond my most optimistic expectations. Armed with Maria's investigation and the evidence gathered by federal agents, my attorney was able to identify and freeze all of Derek's hidden assets before he could transfer them offshore or liquidate them. The civil proceedings were expedited because Derek's federal conviction provided conclusive evidence of his liability for the damage he had caused to my property. The court awarded me $156,000 in damages, enough to fully repair my mother's house, compensate me for lost rental income, cover the legal costs of pursuing justice, and provide additional compensation for the emotional distress Derek had caused through his intimidation tactics. Additional punitive damages were awarded based on the malicious nature of Derek's destruction and his attempts to intimidate me into accepting his criminal behavior. The court specifically noted that Derek's actions represented a calculated campaign of property destruction and victim intimidation that warranted substantial punitive damages to deter similar criminal behavior by others. But the most satisfying aspect of Derek's downfall was learning that his confident assertion that he always wins had been proven spectacularly wrong. The federal prosecution presented evidence that Derek had been telling victims for years that they would never see a penny, and that he was judgment-proof against any legal action they might pursue. Derek Thompson was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple charges. The plea agreement required him to pay full restitution to all identified victims, forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, and submit to financial monitoring for 20 years after his release. The federal judge who sentenced Derek specifically addressed his intimidation tactics during the sentencing hearing. "Mr. Thompson, you built your criminal career on the assumption that your victims would be too intimidated, too poor, or too busy to pursue justice. You calculated that you could cause massive financial and emotional damage to innocent people without facing meaningful consequences. Today's sentence demonstrates that our legal system will hold people like you fully accountable for your crimes, regardless of how cleverly you think you've hidden your assets or how confidently you threaten your victims." The investigation triggered by Derek's activities at my property led to the identification of victims across multiple states, with total restitution exceeding $1.2 million. Derek's entire criminal network was dismantled, with several accomplices also facing federal charges for their roles in the tenant fraud and stolen goods operations. The federal investigation also led to the recovery of stolen property that had been taken from victims across 4 states. Law enforcement agencies were able to return stolen electronics, jewelry, and other valuable items to their rightful owners, providing closure for victims who had given up hope of recovering their possessions. 6 months after Derek's arrest, I stood in my mother's house, fully restored to its original condition and better. The renovations had been completed using funds recovered from Derek's hidden assets, and the property was once again ready to provide quality housing for deserving tenants. The restoration process had been therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Working with contractors to repair the damage Derek had caused allowed me to reclaim my mother's house from the violation it had suffered. Each repaired wall, each replaced floorboard, each cleaned and restored room represented a victory over the criminal who had tried to destroy something precious to me. Mrs. Chen stopped by during the final day of renovation work, marveling at the transformation that had returned the house to its former beauty. The contractors had not only repaired all of Derek's damage, but had also made additional improvements that enhanced the property's value and appeal. "Thomas, I have to say, you handled that entire situation with Derek much better than I expected. Most people would have either given up or done something rash that would have made the problem worse." I thanked Mrs. Chen for her patience and support during the difficult months of Derek's occupancy, but I also reflected on the lessons I had learned about the importance of thorough investigation over immediate reaction. "Mrs. Chen, I learned that sometimes the most effective response to injustice isn't immediate confrontation, but patient investigation that leads to complete accountability." Derek's confidence in his ability to avoid consequences became his greatest weakness. The restoration process also provided an opportunity to implement security improvements that would protect future tenants and deter criminal activity. I installed a comprehensive security system with cameras, motion sensors, and remote monitoring capabilities. I also upgraded the locks, lighting, and other security features to ensure that my mother's house would never again be vulnerable to the type of criminal exploitation Derek had attempted. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected letter from Derek Thompson, written from the Federal Correctional Facility, where he was serving his sentence. The letter was a stark contrast to the confident, dismissive man who had assured me I would never see a penny. Mr. Richardson, I know I have no right to contact you after what I did to your property and the way I treated you, but I wanted you to know that prison has given me time to think about the path my life has taken and the people I've hurt along the way. You were different from my other victims. Most landlords either gave up immediately or tried to fight me with anger and threats that I could easily deflect. You chose a third option that I never saw coming. You treated me with respect, even when I didn't deserve it, then used that time to build a case that I couldn't escape or manipulate. You beat me with patience, investigation, and legal process rather than trying to match my anger and criminality. I realize now that my confidence in my ability to avoid consequences was based on exploiting victims who didn't have the resources or determination to pursue complete justice. I had become so accustomed to intimidating people into accepting losses that I forgot there were people like you who would refuse to be intimidated. The federal investigation that resulted from your case led to the arrest of people I had been working with for years. My entire criminal network was destroyed because I underestimated one retired teacher who refused to accept that justice was impossible. I deserve every year of this sentence, and I hope that the restitution I'm paying helps repair some of the damage I caused. I also hope that other criminals who think they can exploit kind people like you read about my case and realize that kindness doesn't always mean weakness. You taught me that the most dangerous opponents aren't always the ones who threaten you. Sometimes they're the ones who shake your hand and wish you luck while building an airtight case against you. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your approach to this situation taught me lessons that anger and threats never could have. You showed me that there are people in this world who will pursue justice no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. I kept Derek's letter as a reminder that even the most confident criminals can be held accountable when they're victims. Choose investigation over intimidation and patience over immediate reaction. The letter also served as validation that my approach to Derek's criminal behavior had achieved something beyond simple justice. It had created an opportunity for genuine reflection and possible rehabilitation. But Derek's letter also reminded me of the importance of sharing this story with others who might face similar situations. Too many landlords, business owners, and ordinary citizens accept criminal behavior because they believe that pursuing justice is too expensive, too time-consuming, or too unlikely to succeed. Derek's case demonstrated that patient investigation, professional legal assistance, and coordination with appropriate law enforcement agencies can achieve complete accountability even against sophisticated criminals who believe they are immune to consequences. 2 years later, the house at 847 Maple Street is occupied by the Nguyen family, who treat the property with the same respect and care that my mother would have appreciated. Their children play in the front yard where my mother's flowers have been replanted and restored to their original beauty. The Nguyens represent everything I had hoped to achieve when I decided to become a landlord, providing quality housing for families who need a safe, clean place to build their lives while honoring my mother's memory through careful stewardship of her home. But most importantly, Derek Thompson's case became a landmark prosecution that led to stronger tenant screening, requirements, and enhanced penalties for professional tenant fraud. Law enforcement agencies now use his case as a training example for investigating identity theft and property destruction schemes. The local newspaper's coverage of Derek's conviction included a quote from the federal prosecutor that perfectly summarized the lesson his case should teach other criminals. Derek Thompson learned that targeting someone because you think they're vulnerable can be the biggest mistake you ever make. Sometimes the quiet, patient people are the most dangerous opponents you can choose. The detective who investigated Derek's case told me that criminals like Derek rely on their victims being too intimidated, too busy, or too financially strapped to pursue thorough investigations and comprehensive legal action. Mr. Richardson, Detective Martinez said, Derek Thompson made the mistake that eventually catches most career criminals. He got overconfident and targeted someone who had the time, resources, and determination to pursue complete justice rather than accepting partial losses. Today, when I drive past the house at 847 Maple Street and see the Nguyen children playing safely in the front yard, I'm reminded that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes the most effective response to criminal behavior is the patient construction of an airtight case that ensures complete accountability rather than immediate confrontation that allows criminals to escape consequences. Derek Thompson's confident assertion that I would never see a penny became the motivation for an investigation that recovered not only my losses, but compensation for dozens of other victims he had exploited over years of criminal activity. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can say to a retired educator is that they'll never be able to hold you accountable for your actions. Educators spend their careers learning patience, conducting thorough research, and building comprehensive cases for the lessons they want to teach. Derek Thompson received the most thorough education of his criminal career, and I hope other potential criminals learn from his example that some lessons are too expensive to learn through personal experience. If this story resonates with you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that justice doesn't always come quickly, but it can be comprehensive and permanent when pursued with patience and determination. Subscribe for more stories about how quiet persistence can defeat loud intimidation. And remember, sometimes the most effective response to threats is a handshake and the phrase, "Good luck." Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.